The anonymous report alleges educational neglect, Mr. Thompson. The caller stated that your 10-year-old daughter, Lily, has not been seen attending school all year and expressed grave concerns about her welfare and academic development, the social worker. A tired-looking woman named Ms. Albright, who seemed to be running on lukewarm coffee and strained patience, recited the words from her tablet with a practiced neutrality that did nothing to soften their impact. I stood in the doorway of my own home, a place I had bled for in deserts halfway around the world, and felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. Behind her, parked at the curb with a predatory stillness, was a pristine white SUV. And standing on the sidewalk, just past the perfectly manicured edge of my lawn, was Karen Miller, the president of our Homeowners Association, her arms crossed over her expansive chest, a look of triumphant concern plastered on her face like cheap wallpaper. My eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw it all. The petty satisfaction, the thrill of wielding a bureaucratic weapon she didn't understand, the smug certainty of a petty tyrant who believed she had just delivered a killing blow. The accusation wasn't just wrong. It was a violation, a poison dart aimed at the very heart of my family. My wife, Sarah, a former teacher with a master's degree in curriculum development, was the most dedicated educator I had ever known, and our daughter Lily was thriving, curious, and brilliant under her guidance. This wasn't about welfare. This was about power, and I was standing at ground zero of an undeclared war. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping busybody who gets high on the smell of their own authority, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you are about to witness the systematic and legally precise dismantling of a suburban dictator. I drew in a slow, steady breath, the way I'd learned to do when the world dissolved into sand and noise, and the only thing that mattered was the next correct action. My rage was a cold, dense star forming in my chest, but on the surface, I was calm. I was a retired Army colonel, a veteran of the JAG Corps. I had negotiated with warlords and stared down men who built careers on intimidation. Karen Miller and her weaponized phone call were an entirely different kind of enemy, but the principles of engagement remained the same. Assess the threat, gather intelligence, control the narrative, and apply overwhelming, targeted force. I gave Ms. Albright a tight, professional nod. "I see," I said, my voice betraying none of the fury churning within me. "This is a serious allegation. Of course, we will cooperate fully. My wife and I have nothing to hide. Please come in. Perhaps you'd like to see our state-approved curriculum, my daughter's standardized test scores that place her in the 98th percentile, and the detailed portfolio of her work we are required to maintain? We can start with her prize-winning submission to the State Historical Society essay contest." I stepped back, holding the door open, and my gaze flickered past her to Karen, who was now trying to look casual, as if she were merely observing a bit of neighborhood landscaping. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. She had just fired the first shot, assuming I was an unarmed civilian. She had no idea she'd just declared war on a fortress. When Sarah and I bought this house in the pristine, unervingly symmetrical enclave of Willow Creek Estates, we were chasing a ghost, the ghost of a normal life. After 22 years in the Army, moving every 2 or 3 years, living out of boxes and saying more goodbyes than hellos, we wanted roots. We wanted a place where our daughter Lily could have the same friends for more than a flash, where the biggest crisis of the week was a scraped knee or a misplaced library book. The brochure promised a harmonious community, governed by an HOA dedicated to preserving property values and quality of life. To me, it sounded like order and predictability, a welcome change from the chaos I had known. Sarah was more skeptical. She saw the pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS, as a rulebook for conformity, but she agreed for my sake and for Lily's. We chose to homeschool for reasons that were both practical and philosophical. Lily was exceptionally bright, and the lockstep pace of public school bored her to tears. More than that, Sarah, who had seen the inside of the education system for a decade, believed she could provide a richer, more tailored experience. We filed the requisite paperwork with the state, submitted our curriculum for approval, and officially began our journey. For the first year, it was idyllic. We loved our home, the quiet streets, the sense of stability. We met a few neighbors, exchanged pleasantries, and largely kept to ourselves. Then Karen Miller was elected HOA president. It started subtly. A notice about our garbage cans being left out 30 minutes past the designated time. A passive-aggressive comment in the community newsletter about maintaining lawn height to the decimal point. We complied without complaint. We weren't looking for trouble. We just wanted to be left alone. The first real sign of her specific fixation on us came about 6 months before the CPS visit. She appeared at our door, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a scepter. "Mr. Thompson," she began without any preamble, "the board has received a concern." She always used the royal "we" or the anonymous board, as if she were merely the humble messenger of a higher power. "It has been noted that your daughter is home during school hours." Every day I just stared at her. "Yes," I said slowly. "We homeschool." Karen's expression soured, as if I'd confessed to running a meth lab in the basement. "Well," she huffed, "that is unusual. The character of this community is built on families who are engaged with our excellent local school district. It fosters a sense of unity." It was clear she wasn't concerned about Lily's education. She was concerned that we were a deviation from her spreadsheet of what a perfect Willow Creek family looked like. We were a rogue data point, a stain on her uniform landscape. We were different, and to Karen, different was dangerous. I explained, politely but firmly, that our educational choices were a private family matter and were in full compliance with state law. She left in a huff, and the petty notices increased. A fine for a non-approved garden gnome Lily had painted. A warning about the color of our welcome mat. It was harassment, pure and simple, a campaign of 1,000 paper cuts designed to make us fall in line or force us out. I documented every single one. I created a file, a thick one. I learned early in my career that bureaucracy can be a weapon or a shield. Karen was using it as a club, but I was about to forge it into a blade. The CPS call was her grand escalation, her ultimate power play. She had bypassed the trivial world of welcome mats and lawn heights and gone straight for the nuclear option, aiming for the one thing that could truly terrorize any parent. She wanted to break us. She wanted to prove that no one could defy her vision for Willow Creek Estates. Standing there in my foyer, explaining the finer points of Lily's advanced STEM curriculum to a weary social worker, I felt the last vestiges of my desire for a quiet life burn away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Karen Miller hadn't just picked a fight with a quiet veteran. She had kicked a hornet's nest, and she was about to learn that I kept my own, very detailed records. The war for Willow Creek had begun. The first principle of engagement is to control your own position before attacking the enemy's. That meant handling the CPS investigation with absolute professionalism and transparency. Panicking or being defensive would only lend credence to the malicious report. After Ms. Albright left, promising a follow-up visit, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, the silence heavy between us. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly, her face pale. "She called CPS on us, Mark. She actually did it." This was the wound Karen had intended to inflict. The fear, the self-doubt, the feeling of being judged as a parent. I reached across the table and took her hands. "Yes, she did," I said, my voice low and steady. "And she is going to regret it more than anything she has ever done in her life. But first, we handle this. We give Ms. Albright everything she needs and more. We are going to bury her in proof. We are going to make her an ally for the next 48 hours. We worked like we were preparing for a general's inspection. We didn't just gather Lily's schoolwork. We curated an exhibition. Sarah assembled a series of binders, each one meticulously organized. The first contained our official state homeschooling registration, the approved curriculum outline, and copies of the relevant state statutes we were operating under, with key passages highlighted. The second binder was a portfolio of Lily's work, divided by subject. Essays that showed a grasp of history and rhetoric far beyond her years, complex math problems she had solved, detailed lab reports from science experiments we'd conducted in the kitchen, and beautiful, expressive art projects. The third binder was a log of her socialization, the most common and ignorant criticism leveled against homeschoolers. We had photos, schedules, and testimonials from her co-op classes, her soccer team, her volunteer work at the local animal shelter, and her book club at the public library. We included a copy of the award certificate from the State Historical Society. As a final touch, I added a fourth binder. It was my contribution. It contained a concise, one-page summary of my professional background, followed by a copy of my official job description and credentials. I placed it at the very bottom of the stack. We were building a wall of evidence so high and so thick that Karen's anonymous lie would simply evaporate upon contact. While Sarah focused on the academic defense, I launched my own reconnaissance mission. I spent hours online, digging into the public records of our HOA. I read every word of the CC and RS, the bylaws, and every set of meeting minutes published over the last 2 years since Karen took power. Pattern began to emerge. Fines were levied inconsistently. Certain residents, those on the board or friendly with Karen, seemed immune to violations that others were penalized for. There were vague and substantial line items in the budget for community enhancement and administrative expenses that had ballooned under her tenure, with no detailed receipts or explanations. It smelled rotten. The next evening, I saw my opening. George, the retired widower who lived 2 doors down, was struggling with his recycling bin. I went over to help. George was a quiet man who kept to himself, but I'd seen the violation notices on his door. His offense? A small, decorative bird bath that was apparently not on the pre-approved list of lawn ornaments. "Thanks, Mark," he said, breathing a little heavily. "Appreciate it." "No problem, George," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Tough keeping up with all the rules around here, isn't it?" George's eyes clouded over. He glanced around, as if worried Karen had surveillance bugs in the shrubbery. "You have no idea," he muttered. "It wasn't always like this. Before her, it was just about keeping the place looking nice. Now it's like living under a microscope. She fined me $200 because my granddaughter left a tricycle on the driveway overnight." A tricycle, he shook his head, a look of weary defeat on his face. This was the crack I was looking for. "She's crossed a line with my family, George," I said, my voice dropping. "A serious one. I'm not going to let it stand. And I have a feeling I'm not the only one who feels that way." I gave him my card. "If you ever want to talk, or if you know anyone else who's tired of the constant harassment, have them give me a call. Everything will be kept in the strictest confidence." George looked at the card, then up at me, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, in his eyes. He nodded slowly and slipped it into his pocket. The first brick in our coalition had been laid. When Ms. Albright returned 3 days later, we were ready. We sat her down at our dining room table, the 4 binders laid out before her like a legal exhibit. "Ms. Albright," Sarah began, her voice calm and professional, all traces of the previous visit's fear gone, replaced by the cool confidence of a seasoned educator. "We appreciate you doing your due diligence. We've put together some materials we hope will resolve any concerns the state might have for the next hour." She and Sarah went through the binders. I watched Ms. Albright's expression shift from weary skepticism to mild interest, then to genuine surprise, and finally to something approaching awe. She read Lily's essays, examined her math problems, and looked at the pictures of her beaming with her soccer teammates. "This is incredibly thorough," she said, looking up from a detailed report Lily had written on the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies. "This is more comprehensive than the documentation I get from most private schools," Sarah smiled. "We believe in a rigorous, well-rounded education, Ms. Albright. We take our daughter's future very seriously." The social worker closed the final binder and leaned back in her chair. "I can see that," she said, a new respect in her tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, based on what you've shown me, this report is baseless. I'll be recommending the case be closed immediately. Frankly, this is a waste of state resources that could be used to help children who are actually in danger." This was the moment. "We agree," I said, leaning forward. "Which is why I have to ask, what is the protocol for filing malicious and intentionally fraudulent reports? This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a targeted act of harassment by someone using your agency as a weapon." Ms. Albright sighed, the weariness returning to her face. "It's difficult to prove intent, Mr. Thompson. The reports are anonymous for a reason, to protect legitimate reporters. But I will certainly note in my file that the claim was unsubstantiated and appeared to be malicious in nature. That was good enough for now. I had my official record. After she left, I immediately drafted a formal letter to the HOA board of directors and the property management company. I didn't mention CPS directly. That was my ace in the hole. Instead, I detailed a pattern of targeted harassment by the HOA president, Karen Miller, citing the litany of petty violations we had received. I formally requested a hearing with the board and, citing a clause in the HOA bylaws, I demanded access to detailed financial records, including all vendor contracts and expense reports for the last 2 years. I sent it via certified mail. The message was clear. The gloves were off. Karen's response was predictable. 2 days later, a new violation notice appeared on our door. This one was for unapproved landscaping modifications, the modification in question. A small vegetable garden Sarah and Lily had planted in our backyard, which was completely hidden from the street. It was a laughably pathetic overreach, a clear act of retaliation. But it was also another piece of evidence for my file. That evening, my phone rang. It was George. "Mark," he said, his voice a low whisper. "A few of us are meeting tomorrow morning for coffee, away from the neighborhood. We were wondering if you'd like to join us. We need to talk." The resistance was beginning to mobilize. The coffee shop was a small, unassuming place 5 miles from Willow Creek, chosen for its anonymity. There were 4 of them waiting for me at a corner table: George, a young couple named Ben and Maria, who I knew had been cited for the wrong shade of white on their trim, and a woman named Susan, a single mother who had been fined because her teenage son's car, a beat-up but reliable sedan, was deemed unsightly. They all had the same look in their eyes, a mixture of frustration, anger, and hopelessness. They were good people who had been worn down by the relentless barrage of petty tyranny. I bought a round of coffees, and for the next hour I just listened. The stories poured out, a torrent of bureaucratic absurdity and personal humiliation. Karen had measured the height of Ben and Maria's mailbox with a tape measure and declared it a half-inch out of compliance. She had demanded Susan's son park his car in his garage, but when Susan explained the garage was used for storage, Karen had suggested he park it blocks away and walk. She had tried to force George to cut down a beautiful, 100-year-old oak tree in his backyard, because some of its leaves were falling into her prized petunia bed next door. Each story was another thread in the tapestry of her abuse of power, another entry in the ledger I was keeping in my head. They had all tried to fight back individually. They had gone to board meetings, written letters, and been systematically ignored, overruled, or publicly shamed by Karen, who wielded the CC and RS like a holy text and her position as president like a divine right. "She has 2 cronies on the board," Ben explained, stirring his coffee with a plastic stick. "Frank and Linda. They vote with her on everything. The other 2 members are just too intimidated to stand up to her. So she always has a majority. We can't win. That's because you've been fighting her on her terms," I said, setting my cup down. "You've been fighting battles. It's time to fight a war." I laid out my strategy. It wasn't about fighting individual fines anymore. It was about removing her from power. Step 1 was to consolidate our evidence. I asked each of them to go home and create a detailed timeline of every interaction, every fine, every threat, complete with dates, photos, and any correspondence. "Paperwork is her weapon," I told them. "So we are going to drown her in it. We are going to build a case so airtight that the property management company and the other board members will have no choice but to act, if only to protect themselves from liability." Step 2 was my request for the financial records. "I have a feeling," I said, "that her control issues extend to the community's checkbook. If we can find evidence of financial mismanagement, we can argue she has violated her fiduciary duty to the community. That's a firing offense." Step 3 was the most important. We need to go public, not just within the HOA, but outside of it. The next time she tries to push something absurd at a board meeting, we all show up. We don't just show up, we bring friends. We fill the room. We record the meeting. Bullies like her thrive in the dark. We are going to shine a spotlight so bright it burns. For the first time, I saw a spark of hope ignite around the table. They weren't just a collection of disgruntled individuals anymore. They were a movement. Later that week, I received a response from the property management company regarding my letter. It was a boilerplate dismissal, clearly dictated by Karen, stating that the board had reviewed my complaint and found it to be without merit. However, they grudgingly acknowledged my right to view the financial records and gave me a 2-hour window the following week to review them in their office, in the presence of their account manager. It was meant to be an inconvenience, a hurdle. To me, it was a major victory. She had given me access to her armory. As I was preparing my notes for the financial review, another letter arrived. This one was from the HOA, a formal notice of a special meeting called by President Miller. The agenda item was a proposed amendment to the bylaws. My blood ran cold as I read it. Proposal 714. To ensure community standards and protect property values, all homes engaged in at-home educational activities must submit their curriculum, schedule, and instructor credentials to the Architectural Control Committee for annual review and approval. She was doubling down. She was trying to codify her harassment into law. It was an insane, illegal, and breathtakingly arrogant overreach. She was so blinded by her hatred of our defiance that she couldn't see the abyss she was sprinting towards. I immediately forwarded a copy of the notice to my new allies. The message was simple. This is it. The time to act is now. The battle for Willow Creek was about to escalate dramatically. The day of the financial review felt like preparing for a deposition. I walked into the sterile, beige office of the property management company armed with a legal pad, a portable scanner, and a copy of the HOA bylaws. The account manager, a harried-looking man named Dave, showed me to a small conference room where several large binders of financial statements were stacked on the table. "You have 2 hours," he said, checking his watch. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." He clearly wanted no part of this. For the next 119 minutes, I worked with methodical precision. I wasn't just looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for a pattern. I scanned invoices, bank statements, and expense reports, cross-referencing them with the meeting minutes where budgets were approved. It didn't take long to find the rot. There was a landscaping company called Evergreen Solutions that was being paid a staggering monthly fee, far above market rate. A quick search on my phone revealed the company was registered to A.P.O. Box, and the registered agent was a man named Harold Miller, Karen's husband. There were hundreds of dollars in office supply expenses from a high-end stationery store, including personalized letterhead with Karen's name embossed in gold. There were catering bills for board meetings that seemed to coincide with her daughter's birthday and anniversary parties, judging by her social media posts. The most damning find was related to the community pool. The HOA had paid nearly $20,000 to have the pool resurfaced. The contractor, Premium Pool and Patio, was, according to state records, owned by Linda's brother-in-law, one of Karen's loyal board members. I found the original bid from another, highly reputable company that had offered to do the same job for $12,000. Karen had personally recommended the board reject the lower bid, citing concerns about quality. According to the meeting minutes, I scanned every suspicious document, every inflated invoice, every questionable contract. By the time Dave knocked on the door to tell me my time was up, my portable scanner held a treasure trove of evidence. I had her, not just for harassment, but for what looked like a clear case of self-dealing and embezzlement. This was no longer just an HOA dispute. This was potentially criminal. The night of the special board meeting, the community clubhouse, which usually held a dozen apathetic residents, was packed. George, Ben, Maria, Susan, and I had rallied the troops. We had over 50 homeowners there, standing along the walls, filling every chair. When Karen walked in with Frank and Linda, her usual smug confidence faltered for a moment. She visibly bristled at the sight of the crowd, her eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the rebellion. She saw me in the front row, my face impassive, and her expression hardened into a mask of defiant authority. She banged her gavel. "This special meeting of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association will come to order," she announced, her voice straining to project control. "We have one item on the agenda. Proposal 714. She launched into a prepared speech, dripping with condescending concern. She spoke of maintaining standards, protecting our children's environment, and ensuring the academic integrity of the neighborhood. She never mentioned me by name, but her words were aimed directly at my family. She was painting a picture of rogue, unapproved homeschooling as a threat to property values, a blight on their perfect community. This bylaw, she concluded, her voice rising with self-righteous fervor, is a simple, common-sense measure to ensure that any educational activities conducted within our community meet a basic standard of excellence. As reviewed and approved by your elected board, a hand shot up. It was Maria. With all due respect, Karen, she said, her voice shaking but clear. What qualifications does the Architectural Control Committee have to evaluate a school curriculum? Are they licensed educators? Karen waved a dismissive hand. It's a matter of ensuring standards, Maria. We have to trust the board to make discerning decisions. Ben stood up. So you want us to submit private family information to a committee that has no expertise and is under no legal obligation to keep that information confidential? A committee that you control? The room started to murmur. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging worried glances. Karen's face was turning a blotchy red. This is for the good of the community, she snapped, her composure cracking. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I let the chaos build for another moment. Then I slowly stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I wasn't holding a binder or a stack of papers. I just stood there, my hands empty. Karen, I began, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. Before the board votes on this proposal, which is not only a gross overreach of the HOA's authority, but also flagrantly illegal under state education law, I believe the residents of this community deserve to know exactly who they are being asked to trust. I paused, letting the weight of the statement hang in the air. I'm sure it was just an oversight, but in your zeal to protect our property values, you seem to have forgotten to disclose a few things. For instance, your financial relationship with Evergreen Solutions, the landscaping company owned by your husband, which has been paid over $30,000 above market rate in the last year alone from our dues. A collective gasp went through the room. Karen's jaw dropped. Frank and Linda looked at each other in panic. Or the $20,000 pool contract awarded to your friend Linda's brother-in-law, when a reputable company offered to do the job for $8,000 less. I continued, my voice like ice. Or the thousands of dollars in vague administrative and catering fees that seem to be funding your personal lifestyle. I have the documents. All of them. I let my gaze sweep across the faces of the stunned residents. This isn't about standards. This is about control. And it's about money. Your money. I turned my attention back to the board. So, I'll ask you to table this ridiculous, illegal proposal. And I am formally calling for an immediate, independent forensic audit of this association's finances for the last 2 years. And I am also calling for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Karen Miller as president. The room erupted. Karen was sputtering, speechless, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She had walked into her own coronation and found herself at the guillotine. The chaos in the clubhouse was a sight to behold. Karen, for the first time since I'd met her, was completely stripped of her power. She tried to yell, to bang the gavel, to declare the meeting adjourned, but her voice was lost in the sea of angry questions and demands from the homeowners she had lorded over for so long. People were shouting, "Is this true, Karen? Show us the books. Resign now." Her 2 board cronies, Frank and Linda, looked like cornered rats, their faces pale with terror as they realized their complicity was now public knowledge. The other 2 board members, who had always been cowed into silence, now looked emboldened by the crowd's support. One of them, a mild-mannered accountant named Arthur, finally stood up. I second the motion for a forensic audit," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "And I second the motion for a vote of no confidence." That was it. The dam broke. The property manager, who had been lurking at the back of the room, quickly stepped forward, seeing the impending legal nightmare for his company. "The board will take these motions under advisement," he announced, trying to restore a semblance of order. This meeting is adjourned, but it was too late. Karen's reign was over. She was hustled out of the room by her husband, her face a thunderous mask of fury and humiliation. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. The property management company, desperate to avoid a lawsuit, immediately froze the HOA's assets and hired an independent auditing firm. My allies and I formed a temporary oversight committee, working with Arthur and the other non-aligned board member to ensure transparency. We sent out a community-wide email detailing our findings and the steps being taken. The evidence I had gathered was undeniable. The auditors confirmed everything I had found and more, uncovering a systematic pattern of self-dealing, bid rigging, and embezzlement that totaled over $75,000. Evergreen Solutions was a shell company. The premium pool contractor had used substandard materials. The office supplies were, in fact, luxury goods. Stripped of her presidency and facing a massive civil lawsuit from the HOA to recoup the stolen funds, Karen became a pariah. The same neighbors who once feared her now openly shunned her. Her meticulously manicured lawn started to look a little ragged. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard less than a month later. But for me, it wasn't over. The financial malfeasance was one front of the war. The other, the more personal one, was the CPS call. I had been waiting for the right moment to deploy my final weapon. I waited until the audit was complete and the report had been delivered to every homeowner. I waited until Karen's house was officially on the market. Then I made a phone call. I didn't call a lawyer. I called Ms. Albright, the CPS social worker. "Ms. Albright, it's Mark Thompson," I said. "I'm following up on the unsubstantiated and malicious report filed against my family a few weeks ago. You mentioned you would be noting its nature in your file. I was wondering if that process was complete." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. The case is officially closed and flagged as a likely malicious report. As I said, though, proving it is another matter." "I understand," I said calmly. "But new information has come to light that might help establish a pattern of harassment. The person who made the call, Karen Miller, has just been removed as our HOA president pending an investigation for embezzlement and fraud. It seems she has a history of using her position to intimidate residents who don't comply with her demands. This false report against my family was simply the most extreme tool in her arsenal." I could hear the sound of typing on the other side of the phone. "That is very interesting, Mr. Thompson. That certainly adds context." "It does," I agreed. "And as the State Director of Education, I take the weaponization of child protective services against law-abiding homeschooling families extremely seriously." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in Ms. Albright's head as she processed what I had just said. The name on her file was Mark Thompson. The man she was speaking to was the head of the entire state's educational apparatus. "Excuse me?" she finally stammered. "You're the state director." "That's correct," I said, my voice flat and professional. "My office is launching a statewide review of how false reporting laws are being enforced, specifically in cases that appear to target alternative education methods. We'll be working with the Department of Family Services to identify repeat offenders and explore legislative options for stricter penalties. Your case file on my family, along with the corroborating evidence of Ms. Miller's long-term harassment campaign, is going to be our flagship case study. I'll have my chief of staff send over a formal request for the records." I let that sink in. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the system. The very bureaucracy she had tried to use against me was now about to come down on her head with the full weight of the state government behind it. Ms. Albright, no doubt picturing a mountain of paperwork and inquiries from the highest levels of state bureaucracy, was suddenly my most enthusiastic partner. "Of course, Mr. Director," she said, her tone now deferential and crisp. "I will personally see to it that my supervisor is briefed and that your office receives our full cooperation." The trap was sprung. Karen Miller thought she was making an anonymous phone call to harass a non-compliant neighbor. She had no idea she was picking a fight with the one man in the state who could turn that phone call into a career-ending, life-altering catastrophe for her. Her little HOA kingdom was in ruins. Her reputation was destroyed. but I was about to make sure the consequences for her actions echoed far beyond the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates. The news of my professional identity spread through the state bureaucracy with the speed of a lit fuse. Within a week, I had a meeting with the director of the Department of Family Services, a man I knew professionally from interagency budget committees. We sat in his office, the case file on my family, now thick with the supplementary evidence of Karen's HOA malfeasance, on the conference table between us. He was appalled. "This is an egregious abuse of the system, Mark," he said, shaking his head. "Our resources are stretched to the breaking point dealing with legitimate cases of child endangerment. To have someone use our hotline as a personal vendetta. It's unacceptable." "I agree," I replied. "And my concern is that this isn't an isolated incident. How many families who don't have the resources or the knowledge of the system that I do are being intimidated or harassed this way? How many are being scared away from perfectly legal educational choices because of a neighbor with a grudge?" We mapped out a plan. His department would launch an internal investigation into the Miller case, which would almost certainly lead to a referral to the district attorney's office for filing a false report. A misdemeanor in our state, but one they were now highly motivated to prosecute. My department would simultaneously issue a statewide directive to all school districts, reminding them of the laws protecting homeschooling families and establishing a new, streamlined process for reporting harassment from community associations or individuals. We were turning my personal battle into a statewide policy initiative. The symbolic justice was deeply satisfying. The very system Karen had perverted for her own petty ends was now being reinforced and strengthened specifically because of her actions. She had wanted to make an example of my family. Instead, she had made herself the cautionary tale. Back in Willow Creek, the revolution was complete. A new HOA board was elected, with George as the reluctant but universally respected president. Ben and Maria were on the board as well. Their first official act was to schedule a community-wide shredding party. They took the thick, convoluted book of ridiculous rules and regulations that Karen had built up over the years and, with the input of the residents, simplified it down to a few common-sense pages focused on safety and genuine community upkeep. The rule about mailbox height, the approved list of welcome mat colors, the restrictions on children's play equipment. It all went into a commercial-grade paper shredder set up by the community pool, to the cheers of the assembled neighbors. It was a baptism by bureaucracy, a cleansing of the old regime's sins. My family attended, and it felt like a victory celebration. Lily, who had been shielded from the worst of the conflict but knew her family had been under attack, fed a page of the old bylaws into the shredder with a triumphant grin. Sarah stood beside me, her hand in mine, the tension that had been coiled in her shoulders for months finally gone. We were no longer outsiders. We were part of a community that had found its voice and overthrown a tyrant. The most satisfying moment, however, came a few weeks later. I was in my home office when I saw the moving truck pull up to Karen's house. I watched from the window as she and her husband directed the movers, their movements stiff and angry. She never once looked at our house. She couldn't. To look at us would be to acknowledge the source of her downfall. She had started a war with a quiet family, convinced of her own superiority and invincibility, and had been systematically outmaneuvered, exposed, and defeated. As the truck pulled away, carrying the last remnants of her failed reign, George walked over from his house and stood beside me on the lawn. We watched it disappear down the street. "You know," George said, breaking the silence, "for 2 years, I was afraid to put a new bird bath in my own yard. I just wanted to be left alone. I thought fighting back would just make it worse. Sometimes," I said, "the only way to be left alone is to make it clear that you will not be pushed," he nodded, a small smile on his face. "Well, you certainly did that. You should know, the DA's office called me this morning. They're pressing charges against her for filing the false report." A cold, clean wave of satisfaction washed over me. It was the final piece. Her humiliation was public, her power was gone, and now her actions would have lasting legal consequences. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the next time a person in a position of petty authority decided to use a state agency as a weapon to bully a family, they would think twice. They would remember the story of the HOA president who picked a fight with the wrong father and brought the entire system down on her own head. The war was over. We had won. Not just for our family, but for the whole community. The ghost of a normal life we had been chasing had finally become a reality, built on the ashes of a petty tyrant's reign. The months that followed were a study in quiet restoration. The neighborhood seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief from a community that had been holding its breath for 2 years. The atmosphere changed. People started talking to each other over fences again. Kids' toys were left on driveways overnight and no one received a violation notice. Ben and Maria repainted their trim in the exact same wrong shade of white out of principle, and it became a running joke. George, as the new HOA president, governed with a light touch and a philosophy of live and let live. The monthly newsletter, once a passive-aggressive weapon, became a genuine source of community information, with birth announcements and invitations to neighborhood potlucks. It was the harmonious community the brochure had promised all along. It had just taken a war to achieve it. The legal proceedings against Karen moved at a snail's pace, as such things often do, but they moved inexorably forward. She was charged with filing a false report, and the HOA's civil suit to recover the embezzled funds was making its way through the courts. Her name became a verb in the neighborhood. If someone was being particularly overbearing or nosy, they were pulling a Karen. Her legacy was one of ridicule. My work at the state level also bore fruit. The joint task force I had established with the Department of Family Services produced a comprehensive report on the misuse of social services to harass families. This led to a new piece of legislation, which the media dubbed the Homeschooler Protection Act, that significantly increased the penalties for knowingly filing a false report of child neglect, making it a felony on the third offense. I was asked to testify before the state legislature in support of the bill. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the committee members, I didn't just see a group of lawmakers. I saw the faces of my neighbors. I saw George, Ben, and Maria. I saw Sarah and Lily. I told them our story, not with anger, but with a firm resolve. I spoke of the sanctity of the family, the right to make educational choices without fear of reprisal, and the critical need to protect our state's most vital services from being co-opted for personal vendettas. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It was a quiet, profound victory that extended far beyond the cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the moving truck had hauled Karen's life away, our family was working in the backyard. Sarah and Lily were tending to their now thriving vegetable garden, the same garden that had earned us a violation notice. I was repairing a loose board on the deck. It was a perfectly normal, wonderfully boring domestic scene. The new family that had bought Karen's house, a young couple with a toddler, waved as they walked by on the sidewalk. We waved back. There were no clipboards, no threatening letters, no sense of being watched. There was just peace. Later that evening, Sarah and I were sitting on the deck, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. "Do you ever think about her?" Sarah asked quietly. I knew who she meant. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I don't feel anger anymore. I almost feel a kind of pity." She had been so consumed by her desperate need for control, so addicted to the tiny sliver of power her HOA title gave her, that she had destroyed her own life in the process. She had torn her own community apart in an effort to bend it to her will. In the end, all she had accomplished was to unite everyone against her and expose her own corruption. She was a tragic figure in a pathetic, suburban sort of way. She thought our homeschooling was a threat to the community, Sarah mused, a small, ironic smile on her face. But it turned out that her trying to stop it is what actually brought the community together. It was the ultimate irony. Her act of aggression had been the catalyst for the very unity she claimed to cherish, just not in the way she had ever intended. Our family, the nonconformists, the outsiders, had become the unlikely center of a neighborhood renaissance. The battle for Willow Creek had taught me a valuable lesson. I had spent my career dealing with conflicts on a global scale, with enemies who were clearly defined. But tyranny doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a flag. Sometimes it wears a polo shirt and carries a clipboard. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in the fine print of a Homeowners Association's bylaws. and fighting it requires the same principles as any other conflict: strategy, courage, and the willingness to stand your ground. But most of all, it requires the conviction that your home is your fortress, your family is your flag, and the right to live in peace is a right worth fighting for. As the last light faded from the sky, Lily ran out onto the deck and jumped into my lap, smelling of grass and summer. She chattered on about a book she was reading, her mind bright and alive. This was what we had fought for, this simple, perfect, normal moment, and it was worth every second of the fight. The final chapter of Karen Miller's story was written not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a dry legal notice pinned to the community clubhouse bulletin board. It was a settlement agreement. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence in the civil case and a looming criminal trial, she had agreed to pay back a significant portion of the money she had effectively stolen from the HOA. The settlement included a permanent injunction barring her from ever serving on any HOA board in the state again. It was a quiet, bureaucratic end to a reign of noisy terror. Her criminal trial for the false CPS report resulted in a plea bargain, a hefty fine, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent mark on her record. There was no jail time, but for a woman obsessed with appearances and status, the public record of her conviction was a life sentence of humiliation. Her downfall was complete, a self-inflicted wound born of arrogance and overreach. The community she had tried to dominate had not only expelled her, but had also taken legal measures to ensure someone like her could never take power again. The new board, under George's steady leadership, implemented a series of checks and balances. All contracts over a certain amount now required multiple bids and a full vote of the community. The financials were made transparent, posted online for any resident to review at any time. They had learned from their experience and had built a stronger, more resilient community as a result. Our life in Willow Creek settled into a comfortable rhythm. Lily continued to excel in her studies, her world defined not by the four walls of a classroom, but by her own boundless curiosity. She joined the local theater group and discovered a passion for acting, her confidence blossoming on stage. Sarah started a small consulting business, helping other homeschooling families design their own curriculums. Our home was no longer a defensive position in a hostile territory, but a peaceful sanctuary in a neighborhood of friends. I still held my position as State Director of Education, but my experience with Karen had changed me. It had given me a ground-level perspective on the challenges that ordinary families face from overzealous bureaucrats and petty tyrants. I became a fierce advocate for parental rights and local control, using my position to dismantle unnecessary regulations and empower families to make the best choices for their children. The story of what happened in Willow Creek became a quiet legend in my office, a reminder of what was at stake in our policy debates. One afternoon, I was reviewing some budget proposals when my assistant buzzed me. "Mr. Director, there's a Ms. Albright on the line for you. She says it's a personal call." I was surprised. I hadn't spoken to the CPS social worker since the investigation had concluded. I took the call. "Ms. Albright, what can I do for you?" "Mr. Thompson." "Mr. Director," she began, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to call and thank you. That Homeschooler Protection Act you championed? We had a case last week. It was an almost identical situation. An HOA dispute. An anonymous call about educational neglect. But this time, because of the new law, we were able to warn the caller about the felony penalties for a false report. The complaint was withdrawn an hour later. You saved that family from a world of anguish, and you saved my office a week of wasted work." I leaned back in my chair, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over me. This was the true victory. It wasn't just about defeating Karen. It was about changing the system that had enabled her. It was about creating a shield for countless other families who might have faced the same nightmare. "That's the best news I've heard all month, Ms. Albright," I said. "Thank you for letting me know that evening." As I drove home, I took the long way through the neighborhood. I saw kids playing street hockey, neighbors chatting over lawnmowers, the simple, beautiful tapestry of a community at peace with itself. I passed Karen's old house, with its new family and a brightly colored plastic slide in the backyard, a clear violation of her old regime's aesthetic code. It made me smile. I had come to Willow Creek seeking a quiet life, a refuge from conflict. Instead, conflict had found me. But in facing it, in standing up not just for my own family but for my entire community, I had found something more valuable than quiet. I had found a home forged in a crucible of suburban warfare, where the weapons were bylaws and the battlefields were board meetings. A home that we had not just bought but had earned. And as I pulled into my driveway, Sarah and Lily coming out the front door to greet me, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no place on earth I would rather be. The war was long over, and the peace was sweeter than I could have ever imagined.